Hello you mugs, I'm author and publisher Mark David Welsh and welcome to Noir Confidential. Here is where I review my favourite 87 examples of film noir dating from the earliest days of cinema to the end of noir's classic period in 1959. Now these are personal selections of course, but they have been made from an experience of viewing more than 1,000 movies that have been identified by reputable sources as examples of film noir. And be sure to stick around to the end of the video where I deliver my verdict on whether today's film makes the list of the all-time greats or not. But be warned, it's going to be a very, very short list. And please don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you enjoy the video. But be warned, this is a very deep dive into these films, and so there are major spoilers ahead. If you haven't seen the film, go find it, watch it, and then come back to watch this video. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. Today's film is Rebbeca, which was a production of Selznick International Studios based on the novel of the same name by Daphne du Maurier and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It stars Joan Fontaine, Laurence Olivier and Judith Anderson and was produced by David O. Selznick. It opened on March 28, 1940. Our story begins with atmospheric shots of a ruined, overgrown mansion, accompanied by one of the most famous opening lines in movie history.
Last night, I dreamt I went to Mandalay again.
This brief prologue establishes a tragic, sombre mood which sets the tone of events to come, even if most of the film's first act plays more like a romance with our seemingly mismatched protagonists crossing paths in Monte Carlo. Our unnamed heroine, played by Fontaine, is the shy, highly strung paid companion of wealthy, ambitious social climber Mrs. Van Hopper, played by Florence Bates. Our hero is moody English nobleman Maxime de Winter, played by Laurence Olivier, who is haunted by the death of his wife Rebbeca, who drowned off the coast of their luxurious estate almost a year earlier. The two strike up an unlikely friendship which blossoms into an even more unlikely romance. The innocence and naivete of the young woman proves the perfect distraction from Maxim from his dark history. Her natural lack of polish a charming contrast to the accomplished social butterflies who populate his life back home. When Mrs. Van Hopper abruptly decides to leave for New York, Maxime proposes marriage to the astonished young woman, and deep in love she agrees, although Mrs. Van Hopper predicts disaster. After an idyllic honeymoon across Europe, events take a sinister turn when the couple return to take up residency at the Mandalay estate. From the first, the new Mrs. de Winter feels completely intimidated by her surroundings and the servants, led by the sepulchral housekeeper Mrs. Danvers, played by Judith Anderson.
How do you do? How do you do? I have everything in readiness for you.
She gets lost in the house, hides from visitors, and even the simplest social occasion is a minefield of possible severe embarrassment. The spirit of Rebbeca is almost a tangible presence in the house and seems to be passing judgment on every gaffe and faux pas that her successor makes. The dread is accentuated when Mrs. Danvers shows her Rebbeca's personal possessions and her bedroom, which the housekeeper maintains as a shrine. Throughout all this, her new husband remains completely oblivious to her difficulties, treating her more like a young child than an equal partner. Maxime is persuaded to revive Mandalay's annual masquerade ball, but his new wife's excitement at a chance to impress is sabotaged by Mrs. Danvers, who tricks her into wearing the same costume that Rebbeca wore the year before. Upset and distraught, she runs to her room where she considers suicide under Mrs. Danvers' pervasive influence. But they are interrupted when a sudden alarm is sounded as a ship has run aground out in the bay. Unfortunately for Maxime, when the wreck is salvaged, another boat is found on the seabed, the one that belonged to Rebbeca, and worse still, there is a body inside. The publication of Daphne du Maurier's novel Rebbeca was much anticipated. The author was already on the bestseller list thanks to her previous work Jamaica Inn, and the buzz in publishing circles was that Rebbeca was going to be an even bigger hit. So much so that it attracted significant offers from Hollywood studios prior to its publication. British film director Alfred Hitchcock also tried to buy the rights, having filmed Jamaica Inn a year earlier. He'd first grabbed the attention of audiences and critics with his stylish take on The Lodger in 1927, based on a novel and play focusing on the hunt for a Jack the Ripper-like serial killer in London. 2 years later, he delivered the first British talkie Blackmail, again to much acclaim. But it was for a string of thrillers produced by Michael Balcon in the mid-1930s that the director first attracted serious attention from America, particularly for The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1934 and The 39 Steps a year later. By 1938, Hitchcock was keen to make the move stateside because he was frustrated by the limited technical resources available at homegrown studios. Perhaps he could also see the writing on the wall for the British film industry at the time. The major international commercial and critical success of Alexander Korda's The Private Life of Henry VIII in 1932 had led to a massive boom in financing, but the lack of any similar success in the years since meant that purse strings were tightening as the money men grew frustrated with the lack of return on their investments. Hitchcock actively courted the press on both sides of the Atlantic and did receive several offers from Tinseltown. However, these mainly focused on his remaining in England and using the various American studios' British resources. This idea did not interest him. Selznick International Pictures was somewhat of an anomaly in the golden age of Hollywood. A relatively small concern in some ways, they repudiated the production line methods of the other studios, instead focusing exclusively on delivering a small number of high-budgeted A pictures. At its head was the workaholic David O. Selznick, fueled by Benzedrine, a legendary addiction to sending out lengthy memos, and an obsessive need to oversee every minute aspect of each of his studio's productions. Hitchcock and Selznick circled each other for a while, but after they finally met, a deal was struck. Although very different men, perhaps it was simply that they recognised something common to both, a commitment to quality. And Selznick had purchased the film rights to Rebbeca, so it was no surprise when that property became the director's first American assignment for his new boss. On publication, Rebbeca was an instant smash on both sides of the Atlantic, both as a novel and as a play, which was adapted for the stage by du Maurier herself. Selznick also held the American radio rights and sold them at a ridiculously cheap price to Orson Welles. It was a canny move. Welles had shocked the nation with his War of the Worlds broadcast on Halloween 1938, and it was only 5 weeks later that his adaptation of Rebbeca was aired as part of the Campbell Playhouse. The hype was on. But there were some problems. If there's one consistent criticism of Rebbeca over the years, it centres around the character of the main protagonist, the second Mrs. De Winter. Too passive, too wet, too reminiscent of those Victorian Gothic heroines who ran off to their bedchambers in floods of tears when someone looked at them the wrong way. Du Maurier never even gives her a name in the novel, probably to encourage her female readership to insert themselves into the narrative in her place. The author even teases this anonymity on a couple of occasions in the text by having Maxine mention how much he likes her name, but of course he never uses it. Part of the reason for the criticism of the novel's main character probably arises from the sheer amount of internal monologuing centred around her doubts and insecurities. Now don't get me wrong here, it's brilliantly written, but there is an awful lot of it, and perhaps a little judicious trimming could have been considered. It would have tightened the narrative a little too. My only other criticism of the novel is again a very minor one, in that du Maurier initially has her heroine telling the story from a point in her far future, in fact when she is approaching early middle age. Of course this does give us the spellbinding opening, which is close to perfect, but the author persists with the device for the first few chapters, and I think it puts a barrier between the character and the reader until it's finally dropped. Some of the prose here also acts as a bit of a spoiler as to the eventual fate of the two principal characters. The second Mrs. De Winter also became a serious point of contention between Hitchcock and Selznick when it came to scripting the film. The latter was very keen to remain faithful to the highly successful source material, but the director was concerned by the story's static nature, both in its lack of action and the development of the leading lady. There were some compromises reached, but inevitably Selznick mostly got his way. It's interesting at this point to compare the book with the film. Curiously enough, some of the changes made in adaptation served to weaken the character of the second Mrs. De Winter rather than enhance her, as you might reasonably expect. One of these choices leads to the most obvious misstep in the finished film. This revolves around the scene where she is immediately sent packing to her room by Maxim after turning up dressed in the same way as Rebecca at the party. In the film, she collapses on the bed in an overdone fit of hysterical weeping and finds herself in the clutches of Mrs. Danvers, who tries to persuade her to leap from the second-story window of the house. The accident with the trawler in the bay curtails the scene before it can go any further. Now, this confrontation between housekeeper and heroine does occur in the book pretty much as it appears on the screen, and it ends the same way, but crucially it takes place the morning after the party. In the book, the new Mrs. De Winter is severely upset by the dress incident, of course, but eventually puts on a substitute costume and attends the ball, albeit in a disconnected, almost mechanical kind of way. It's not a big character epiphany by any means, but this is a woman who just a few chapters earlier was hiding from any house guests that arrived and was hideously embarrassed by her own existence. Her action in returning to the ball displays a certain amount of character growth. Also, the party, as seen from her distorted perspective, would have presented a chance for Hitchcock to indulge in some cinematic flourishes and experimentation. In one way, the decision to join the scenes together in the film is understandable. It's tidier and the plot advances quicker, but it does feel like a double opportunity missed when you compare it to the novel. In a similar way, there's a scene very late on in the book where our heroine tells off Mrs. Danvers and finally asserts herself as mistress of Mandalay at last, a crowd-pleasing moment if ever there was one, but it's strangely absent from the film. What we get instead is the new wife taking the lead after Maxim confesses to the true circumstances of Rebecca's death and planning out a strategy so he can avoid taking the blame for it. It's very welcome, but it could be viewed as too little too late. Similarly, the fact that the movie has her organise the masquerade ball rather than just leave it to Mrs. Danvers, as happens in the book, invites a similar accusation. And now to the murder. In the novel, it's straightforward enough. Rebecca goads Maxim into shooting her by pretending that she's pregnant with another man's child, who will eventually inherit Mandalay. It's the last straw after her long-term adulterous behaviour, and he fires. The bullet conveniently missing any bones, so there's no forensic evidence of the gunshot after the body's been underwater for almost a year. In the film, however, that's not how it goes down at all. Having the hero shoot a woman dead, whatever the provocation, was bad enough for a film made in 1940, but to make things immeasurably worse, in order to get our happy ending, he has to get away with it. This was simply unacceptable for the time when the film was made. Crime and punishment had to go hand in hand. It was still a sore point some 5 years later when director Fritz Lang attempted to subvert this convention with the climax of his 1945 noir Scarlet Street. But in the case of Rebecca, the censorship office, whose power in Hollywood at the time cannot be understated, demanded a very different set of circumstances surrounding the death of Rebecca De Winter. Selznick huffed and puffed and fumed, but he could do nothing about it. So in the film, Max doesn't shoot Rebecca at all. Their final argument is transferred to the cottage on the beach and is related to his new wife by Maxim rather than being shown in flashback, both of which were good choices. However, in the film, Rebecca simply stumbles and falls during the confrontation, hitting her head on some fishing tackle lying on the floor. Exit Rebecca. This resolution to the issue was the censor's suggestion, but the fact that her death is just the result of a stupid accident rather than murder doesn't just rob the film of a lot of its dramatic tension, but begs a very obvious question. Why didn't Max simply go to the police and tell them everything at the time? Who would believe me, he asks, when his new wife voices that very question. Well, most people, I would think. Yes, there'd be a stink and tongues would wag when Rebecca's lifestyle came to light, but it seems a far more obvious course of action to come clean right away than invite a charge of murder later on by trying to cover things up. Of course you can make allowances for people making stupid decisions in highly stressful situations, but Maxim's rather involved actions on the night do push the suspension of disbelief and weaken the story considerably, especially seeing that elsewhere he's portrayed as a capable and very level-headed character even if he has a very short fuse. Another interesting decision in the adaptation was to remove some of the nuance from the character of creepy housekeeper Mrs. Danvers and present her as a more one-dimensional type of villain. In the film, we're simply shown that she's unbalanced, unhealthily obsessed with her late mistress. The censors were again very keen that no lesbian relationship was implied, which meant that the filmmakers had to tread very carefully, although the implications are pretty obvious to a modern audience. However, in the novel, Du Maurier presents Mrs. Danvers as a woman who is ill rather than outright malicious. She even has a crying scene later on which engages the reader's sympathy to some extent. And unlike the film, she does not receive her fiery comeuppance in the burning ruins of Mandalay. Instead, the book ends with Maxim and his new wife seeing the sky alight when they return from visiting Rebecca's doctor in London. They realise that Mandalay is burning, and it's heavily inferred that Mrs. Danvers is responsible, but the final conflagration is left completely to the reader's imagination. One of the best changes made in transferring the novel to film, however, is the inclusion of a new initial meeting for Maxim and his prospective bride. Instead of taking place in the Monte Carlo hotel dining room, this occurs on a cliff edge, providing some immediate tension and foreshadowing the dark events to come suggested by the short prologue. It was a smart decision, especially considering that the next 20 minutes or so of the picture feature the early days of our leading character's awkward May to December romance. Several actors were considered for the part of the moody nobleman. Both Selznick and Hitchcock wanted Ronald Colman, but he turned it down. Other names were discussed before they settled on Laurence Olivier, who had recently returned to Hollywood while wife Vivien Leigh made Gone with the Wind for Selznick. He was a celebrated stage actor, of course, who famously disdained the movies, a quality which was thought would play well into the role of the slightly arrogant, aloof Maxime de Winter. The female lead proved somewhat harder to cast. Over 30 actors were auditioned, including eventual choice Joan Fontaine, sister of the far better known Olivia de Havilland, who was also shooting Gone with the Wind at the time. Fontaine had some experience in supporting roles and was the female lead in Gunga Din with Cary Grant, but that film had given her very little real acting to do. Hitchcock was not impressed with her, and after viewing the screen test, investor Jock Whitney's opinion was that she was, quote, so bad that I cannot see her playing the role otherwise than as a dithering idiot or, in her other version, a talking magazine cover, end quote. However, Whitney deferred to Selznick's opinion on the actress, although he did suggest further tests of her were necessary. In the end, she got the part, of course, something Hitchcock always believed that Selznick had intended from the very beginning. He may have been right. Fontaine and Selznick had met the year before, and the producer did pursue the young actress, although she always maintained that she never surrendered to his advances. Whatever the truth, casting such a relatively inexperienced player in the pivotal role of such a prestigious and expensive production was a serious risk. After all, she's rarely off-screen for the entire 130 minutes of the film. As it was, after shooting began, Olivier soon wanted her replaced, but Hitchcock persevered. Never usually one to spend a lot of time with actors on the set, he reportedly coached Fontaine heavily through her performance, so much so that script supervisor Lynn Schiller called her, quote, practically a puppet, end quote. Also informing Fontaine's work must have been her own personal circumstances. She was young and inexperienced and a newcomer amongst a veteran cast and crew. Some believe that Hitchcock manipulated the working environment to increase Fontaine's personal insecurities and her isolation to better inform her final performance. In her autobiography, No Bed of Roses, the actress acknowledges that the rest of the cast did seem very much of a clique that she was not invited to join. When it comes to her other memories of making the film, Fontaine states that, quote, "it was a learning time," end quote, and that Hitchcock had, quote, "patience, authority. He had taste. Most of all, he had imagination. We liked each other and I knew he was rooting for me," end quote. And that's pretty much all she wrote. In a 277-page autobiography, she devotes about a page to the making of the film that turned her into a star. Make of that what you will, although it's worth mentioning that she devotes even less time to the production of follow-up film Suspicion, for which she won the Oscar. Fontaine had spent a sickly, reclusive childhood, being passed between various family members, including a stepfather who once showed the 6-year-old girl a shallow grave that he had dug in the garden, telling her that's where she was going to end up if she didn't stop biting her nails. Further stellar examples of parenting followed, all of which early experiences, along with her sister's well-established status as a bona fide movie star, was unlikely to have left the teenage Fontaine with a great deal of self-confidence going into the shoot. But then again, wasn't that the emotional state of the character that she was bringing to life? There were other significant challenges during the filming. Selznick thought Hitchcock's working methods were too slow and made endless creative suggestions, which of course the director heavily resented. There were many disagreements, long hours and production delays before principal photography finally wrapped on November 20th, 1939. The shoot had taken 63 days, which might not seem unreasonable today, but Selznick had scheduled it for only 42. Unlike other producers, it was Selznick who supervised the cutting in the editing room, a process which allegedly enhanced Fontaine's performance significantly. A few minor retakes were ordered before the film previewed with an audience, very favourably, in February 1940. The New York opening at Radio City Music Hall followed in March. Good word of mouth and critical praise made the picture a significant hit, although it never quite became the box office bonanza that Selznick had expected. When Oscar season came around, the film gathered an impressive 11 nominations, including Hitchcock for Best Director, Fontaine, Olivier and Anderson for their performances, Best Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Editing, Score and Special Effects. In the end, it won only 2 statuettes, one for George Barnes's moody black and white cinematography, but more importantly, the award for the year's Best Picture. So after all that, how good is the final film? Well, very good indeed. One of its major virtues is simply the all-round high quality of the piece. All those Oscar nods in the technical areas are very well deserved and combine to give the finished film that unmistakable glow of classic Hollywood where the money was up there on the screen for all to see. Mandalay possesses the scale and imposing antiquity almost of an ancient castle, staffed by an army of parlour-maid stewards and footmen. Hitchcock's shot selection conveys the frightening majesty and exclusivity of the life of the nobility, instantly getting the audience on side with the shy, socially awkward second Mrs. De Winter. Who could not fail to identify with her feelings of inadequacy as she loses her way in the maze of passages and rooms, and finds herself unable to escape the solicitous attentions of one member or another of that formidable battalion of household staff? When she breaks a Cupid ornament and hides the pieces away, it's a perfectly understandable reaction that everyone can relate to. And that brings us to one of the film's greatest strengths. Whether it was a combination of Hitchcock's coaching, Selznick's cutting, or her own talent as an actress, Fontaine simply knocks it out of the park as the second Mrs. De Winter. Although some involved on the picture at the time felt that her underplaying hurt the film, of course it stood the test of time far better than a more demonstrative performance would have done. In particular, it's her body language, which is perfectly controlled and conveys her inner emotions far better than reams of dialogue or a misplaced voiceover ever could. As already mentioned, Fontaine won the Oscar for Best Actress the following year for her next film Suspicion, also directed by Hitchcock. Again, she's very good in it, but I can't help but feel that the award was given as a slightly shamefaced apology by voters who realised that she should have got it for Rebbeca. Anderson is also terrific as Mrs. Danvers. She almost seems to glide around Mandalay like a spectre at the feast, a pent-up dark cauldron of emotion ready to explode at the least provocation. She has some great scenes, particularly the one where she shows the new Mrs. De Winter Rebecca's old room in her clothes. It's the moment when we realise that she's more than just a little displeased by the younger woman's arrival. And if the censorship office didn't pick up on the implications of her fondling her dead mistress's night things, then I guess that only goes to show a blissful ignorance on their part. The male cast come off less well. Olivier's Oscar nomination is a bit of a puzzle. He often seems stiff and unsympathetic, even after he's unburdened himself to Fontaine's character and declared his love for her. Having said that, he is a little more human than in most of his film roles of the time. Witness this wonderful wordless exchange with Fontaine in his car during their courtship. But it's hardly an award-worthy performance. It also hurts me to venture the opinion that George Sanders is miscast as Rebecca's lover Jack Fivell. Yes, of course he can play the cat, he often did to wonderful effect, but his Fivell seems too detached, dry and cynical, typical Sanders in fact, when perhaps a less bloodless, more passionate portrayal might have helped with the drama in the final act. When his blackmail scheme goes awry, we get the impression that he's just going to shrug his shoulders and go for a brandy and soda at his club and maybe a game or two of billiards. Generally, the supporting cast is wonderful though, straight from Hollywood's seemingly bottomless pool of outstanding character talent. We get bumbling Nigel Bruce as Maxime's brother-in-law, Reginald Denny making something out of nothing as Mandalay's estate manager, and the imperious C. Aubrey Smith as the local magistrate. There's also a great turn from Florence Bates as Mrs. Van Hopper, although it was an apparent struggle for Hitchcock to get that performance out of her. She was actually a lawyer, and it was only her second screen appearance at the age of 52, the first being an uncredited bit part. By the time she died, just 14 years later, she had racked up a further 78 screen credits. Finally, we have the fact that these elements are tied to an unusual, compelling story, masterfully delivered by a director fired up by suddenly being able to work on the bigger canvas that he had always sought. In later years, Hitchcock tended to dismiss Rebecca and to some extent the other pictures he made with Selznick, but that's probably because he had not enjoyed full creative control on those projects. So in summary, douse the lights, sit back and be prepared to be seduced by a true Hollywood classic.
So is Rebecca the very first entry on my list of the best of film noir? Well, after all I've just said in praise of the film, you might reasonably expect that I'm going to include it. But instead, my answer is no. Why not? Well, a few minor reasons and one major one. To check off the minor points to begin with, the story is gripping, but it doesn't have the layers of complexity that I find are usually an essential element of the greatest of the noirs. There's also the weakness of the male characters here, particularly Maxime. I never felt half invested in him and his situation as I felt in that of his new bride. He's insensitive, a little arrogant, and in Olivier's hands, just not very relatable. And then there's the crime itself. Making Rebecca's death an accident reduces Maxime to a simple victim of circumstances, which takes the edge off the story considerably. But mostly my decision is down to something I guess I'll be coming back to from time to time during this series, and that's my personal take on a very fundamental question. Is this a film noir at all? Sure, it has some of the elements, the moody atmosphere, the sense of dread and foreboding, of deadly secrets, and of current events dictated by past misdeeds, or in this case, past circumstances. But much as I hate to stick labels on films, isn't this really more of a romantic drama or a mystery than an actual full-blooded film noir? In my opinion, I think it is. So Rebecca doesn't go onto the final list. However, it's still a terrific film, and one that I would encourage you to re-watch if it's been a few years since you last saw it. It certainly knocks spots off the rather bland Netflix remake. And I would certainly encourage you to buy the Blu-ray of this classic Hollywood film. It's money well spent. Now, some of the books that I used to research the production and history of this film were as follows: Hitchcock and Selznick by Leonard J Leff, No Bed of Roses, the autobiography of Joan Fontaine, and Showman, the life of David O. Selznick by David Thomson, which I particularly recommend as a formidable work of film scholarship. It's endlessly readable, entertaining and enlightening. And of course, also the original novel of Rebbeca by Daphne du Maurier. Now, if you're interested in the whys and wherefores of my search for the greatest in noir, click on the end of this video where there's a link to the overview of the project. And don't forget to like this video if you've enjoyed it. Even subscribe to my channel if you're interested in hearing more about film noir. It would be much appreciated. Thank you. And all that's left is for me to wish you a very long and pleasant good night.